Do we need a declaration of digital rights? And for this one, I would like to invite our following moderator, Lindsey Nefesh-Clarke, who is the founder and managing director of W4, Women's World Wide Web. That is an international organization and Europe's first crowdfunding platform dedicated to girls and women's empowerment, with a focus on promoting their equal access and participation in information and communication technologies. Lindsey, it's in your hands.
Thank you, Victoria. Well, the previous panel was a perfect segue into ours. It's my pleasure and privilege to moderate this morning's panel discussion, where we will be debating the question, do we need a declaration of digital rights? I think everybody in this room would concur that this issue of digital rights is a crucial one, and it throws up many weighty issues. We have 4 distinguished speakers who will be addressing this question from different vantage points. It's my pleasure to introduce them and to invite them to join me on stage. Gael Duval, founder of Ultio & I, if you could join me. Thank you. Estelle Massé, who is a lawyer and senior policy analyst and global data protection lead with Access Now. Welcome. Julie Owono, also a lawyer and executive director with Internet Without Borders. And Jacques Galvani, who is partner at School Lab and also the chairman of the nonprofit Club 21e siècle. Okay, so before I turn to our speakers, I'd like to take the temperature in the room. Raise your hand if you think we do need a declaration of digital rights. Oh, there are some hands not raised. That's fascinating. Let me just take in who's not raised their hand so I can come back to you. Oh, you see, now it goes up. Teasing. Raise your hand if you think this is an urgent issue. Okay. And I'd like to ask you in the audience, just in 1 or 2 words, we won't have time to pass the mic around, but in 1 or 2 words, what does this question evoke for you? When we say a declaration of digital rights, who wants to go first? Anybody? Justice? Equity? Privacy? Transparency? Risk of regulation coming next. Well, we'll be talking about that, Elizabeth. Any other ideas? Ethics? We had some ideas over there. Human rights, yes, from where I'm coming from, it would be stopping gender violence, protecting girls and women from gender violence online. Anything else? That's already good. We'll come back to you. Okay, so before, we are going to address this question head on, but before we do that, I'd just like to ask each of you to say a little, just succinctly, very succinctly, about your respective current activities. Maybe we start with Jacques.
Hi, thank you, Lindsey. So I'm Jacques Galvani. I'm partner at School Lab, so I'm in charge of developing our activity with large corporations, in particular, and strategy and organization assignments. And I'm also chairman of Club 21e siècle, which is a non-profit organization created about 15 years ago, which focuses on the issues of diversity and inclusion. But we also are very involved about everything that's about cohesion, social cohesion, and we also think a lot about everything that's linked to individual rights, and we cooperate with other non-profit organizations in Europe and around the world about this topic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. So I'm Julie Owono from Internet Without Borders, or in French, Internet Sans Frontières. It's a Paris-based nonprofit working on the protection of digital rights or human rights in the digital era and space. And we particularly focus on protecting freedom of expression, how to fight against censorship worldwide, which is unfortunately growing, and also how to fight against surveillance, data exploitation by private companies, among other topics, and also access to internet. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Estelle Massé. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at Access Now, which is an international NGO that also works for the protection of human rights in the digital era. We've been created about 10 years ago as a tech NGO providing mesh networks to activists and journalists in Iran and in MENA region in order to broadcast revolution happening in the country and allowed dissident voices to express themselves freely. Since then, we've grown into an organization that provides 24/7 support to those journalists all around the world in order to secure their sources, their information, and provide digital security advice to anyone who needs it. And we've created a campaign and a policy team, of which I'm a member of, which advocates around the world for government and corporation to have policies and practices that protects people's rights online.
Hi, I am Gael Duval. First, thank you for inviting me to this panel this morning. So I've been an IT entrepreneur for 20 years now. I started with a well-known Linux distributions, which was called Mandrake Linux, but that is old story now. And more recently, I have created an initiative to get free from Google and to offer an alternative to Apple and Google Android on the mobile. So we are creating a eFoundation, which is doing some operating system for mobiles that are totally ungoogled. And well, it is getting pretty good traction, actually.
Okay, excellent. I'd just like to frame this discussion. So there is a general consensus that we need greater regulation of the digital space. Even the big tech companies are asking for this. But the question is also, how do we achieve this? Do we achieve this through our current legal framework, through the application of, say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the digital space? Some people say yes, and they're pushing for this. Others would argue that we need to go even further. We need to reimagine our existing rights and draft new digital rights, an internet of rights, or even further than the internet of rights, and rights that cover the full range of our digital interactions. And so just recently I was looking at the website of Article 19, the nonprofit Article 19, and among those digital rights, for example, there were things like right to anonymity, right to encryption, right to hack, and right to floss, which I learned was the right to access free, libre, and open source software, among other rights. Now, Julie, I'm going to start with you. You're really working, it's at the heart of the work you're doing. My question for you is, what is your approach to this particular question? What's the kind of work you're doing? And what would your ultimate position be on this question?
So we do agree that there is a need for protection. It's super urgent, as we have seen many hands being raised. But we feel at Analyst Sans Frontières that the threats are so important. It's already very difficult to keep up with the speed of development of innovation and to keep up with the needs to further protect the existing rights, that investing a lot of energy in adopting an international text, a declaration, which ultimately may not be that binding. The energy spent on that would not be spent on using what is existing already, what in our opinion works, I'll give examples, to protect already what is urgently needed to protect. So for instance, you mentioned the Universal Human Rights, the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in the framework of the United Nations, which virtually every government in the world, so every government part of the General Assembly of the UN has to adopt. Well, this declaration has a set of rights which can be applied online. The UN, by the way, has already said that all the rights that apply offline apply online with the same strength and and should be protected the same way. For instance, the freedom of expression, it does mean something when we talk about freedom of expression on the internet. It means that you have the right to type whatever you want, as long as, of course, it doesn't violate someone else's right. So, for instance, it doesn't spread hate speech. It has the right to privacy. We don't have, let's imagine that, okay, it's the digital world, so there is no physical, space where you can close the door and say, that's my privacy, of course, but you have encryption, for instance, that can technically protect that virtual space from a third party, someone's eye. So yeah, we think that there is enough material to harness and to apply in the digital space. And that's something that the UN is trying to do. They have special rapporteurs, for instance, special rapporteurs for freedom of expression, special rapporteur for freedom of association, whose role is to make sure that all the rights that have been proclaimed are indeed applied by governments and how they are applied. And each year, these rapporteurs publish reports, basically on the state of the rights that they're and the freedoms that they're observing and working on. And this year, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association is exploring how to translate freedom of association online. And it creates avenues for reflection. For instance, when, let's say, a web hosting company decides to delete the account of Charlottesville demonstration participants, what does that mean? Does that mean is it a violation of their right to associate online? These are interesting questions. So I think, yes, we should harness, we have a lot of energy. We should invest it in harnessing what's existing. Doesn't mean that we do not need to get into details. We do need the details, of course. We do need to talk about encryption. What does it mean legally? Do we need how to embed it in the code? Because that's the question ultimately from a technical perspective. But yeah, investing a lot of, let's see with the environment, it took so many years to adopt a binding text on carbon emissions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, so I'm going to change the order here because, as you said, it took so many years to adopt the legislation about carbon emissions. Actually, I'm going to turn to you, Estelle. And I read, there's a quote in an article from the end of 2018 that said, on this subject of digital rights, legislatively, and I'm an English mother tongue, there's still a chasm between the offline and online worlds. The digital norms of today have a long way to go to become the hard legal rules that we will need to securely protect human rights online. At this point, can I bring you in, Estelle, and ask you about the work you're doing, and ask you also maybe to talk to us about your point of view when it comes to the government's role in ensuring the protection of people's rights in the digital landscape?
Thank you. So when we talk about bringing a charter of digital rights or bringing digital rights into reality, what we're talking more is about enforcing the existing right rather than creating new frameworks, because, as Julie mentioned, there has been a lot of resolution at UN level, but also regional and local level, that have put into jurisprudence and into text that the right that exists offline apply online. This has happened at the level of European Union when the Charter of European when the Charter of Fundamental Rights, was included into the Lisbon Treaty and created, in addition to a right to privacy, a separate right to data protection, for instance. This also happened at French level when we have decision of the constitutional councils that recognize a right to access the internet as a subpart of the right to free expression. So we're not without frameworks. We're just adapting those frameworks and interpreting it into into the context of the digital environment, which is fast changing and we're catching up. But instead of maybe creating new set of rules, we just need to make sure that the rules we have now applies to this online environment. And this means that the frameworks we have, which were hard fought, and people in Normandy know about that, and took a long time to establish and create, are fit for the offline world and the online world. And what we need is perhaps operationalize them, to the online environment. And this is where states have a responsibility to understand that not because something happens online doesn't mean it has to be banned. There is a lot of reactionary measures that trying to blame the internet for a lot of social problems and having a reaction of more toward caution and censorship rather than fostering freedoms online, which can bring a lot of benefits. And this is where those fundamental texts that we have are really important. But we already have a lot of jurisprudence that has been built here. So there is a need for the states and the judicial powers to interpret those rights in the context, and also making sure that when we come to digital freedom, we come with a mindset of expanding those freedom rather than restricting them.
Great, excellent. I just want to pick up on the wording you said. You talked about catching up. So if I can now move on maybe to you, Gael. You're an entrepreneur, you're a successful entrepreneur navigating the business world. And couldn't we say that, you know, in the corporate world, we're seeing, I'm deliberately being provocative, that we're seeing companies taking advantage of the ambiguous digital regulations. So when we talk, you know, there's a lot of concern about how our user data is being monetized, etc. Keen to hear your point of view on this question, and also what you think should be the role of business when it comes to. Yeah, really see, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if that means you're not entirely sure that business should play a role. We want to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, so I think it's important actually to consider that this is really a question of public sector and private sector, especially in the internet world, because what we see now is that the private sector, in particular the GAFA, the big tech, they are taking over all those infrastructure services that ideally should be owned by not the governments, but countries and the people. And so just I wanted to go back to the discussion. I'm reading at the moment the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights.
That's excellent.
And let's take an example. If you take Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Okay, so this, I think, probably this really needs to be extended because there is the right to be forgotten, for instance, in this article. So, okay, it's there and this can be applied, but probably it's not enough for the internet because the context has changed a lot, and the physical world. This Declaration of Human Rights was written for the digital world and offline world, and online it's all different because when you put a data online, if there is no regulation and laws to protect the people, this data is here forever, and so if you put a picture, or if you put a bad word or something, it's really here for forever. So if there is not a law regulation to say I have the right to ask that this thing, this personal data has to be removed and shouldn't be public on the internet because internet is a public thing, it's complicated. So, and it's really, there is another article in this text which is talking about access to public services. And I think it's very important because at the moment, what is the public service in internet? Okay, it's internet, the infrastructure, the tubes where the data is going through, but it is also social media. Is Facebook a public service? is Google a public service, Google search? So where is the law applying here? We are talking about fundamental rights, but if those services are owned and defined by a private sector, there is a need for regulation here, probably.
So Gael, you're clearly saying that the current legal framework is not sufficient and we need to go further and make sure that there is adequate regulation in place. And the role of business in that?
I mean, the role of business is to innovate, and the role of governments is to regulate, probably. I'm not in favor of strong regulation. It's a personal point of view, but at the moment the situation is so bad that we really need to do something, and probably that the European Union has to show the way, because we have the GDPR in place. Well, it's a good start. It's probably not enough, because we probably need something that will be more privacy by design, and the GDPR is much more ask for consent. But yes, we need to show the way, probably at the European Union level. But I think we need a global text, international text, and it will take a lot of time and probably years. But so if that's the case, we have to start it now, probably, to have a general background, generally accepted by the United Nations. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, on the same Article 19, when I was looking at, what kinds of digital rights, well, obviously there's also the right to access, and we were talking yesterday about, half the population doesn't have access to internet. So when we talk about an internet of rights, we have to bear that in mind too. I'd like to turn to you, Jacques. Okay, do we need a declaration of digital rights? And I think the question is, do we have sufficient legal framework in place, or do we need to be imagining something else and going further?
Okay, so I was thinking that I'm probably the less competent person in the panel to talk about this. So the easiest thing to do in this case probably to take general ideas. So, but I think it's very interesting because when I was listening about what you were saying, Gael, Estelle, Julie, and what people say in the room, you have some keywords are interesting, and you had justice, protection of women and children. You said that. You said be free from Google, protection from big corporation, countries and people, global, and having a global text. You said that. And on the other side, I listened things like about liberty, fear of more regulation coming on, expanding digital freedom. What I will try to do to discuss with you, it will be how we can try to spot a few points about the background of all these ideas and the philosophical background, is a big word, of these ideas. And very interesting because the debate is not a new debate. It has been a debate for centuries and expressed in different texts, legal text, and philosophical text. And so basically you have two ways to see it. The first one is that you can see internet and social media as a place to create a free place for expression and liberty and possibility to protect individual against the tyranny of government. The other way to see it is that internet and the social media can be a place to guarantee security, a place where you have to guarantee security and safety for users, because with extreme individual liberty can come extreme risk. And if you take the first side and you sit by the first side, you will put everything about the positive impact of digital and individual liberties, like the role of internet and social media in the revolution and citizen movement in North Africa recently, for example. If you take, for example, in France, we had the Gilets jaunes movement, and you can say, okay, this, if we didn't have the social media, these people wouldn't have an opportunity to express what they wanted to say outside of the representative political system and his limits. Or you can also think how our internet helps all liberation and resistance movement around the world. for example, the Me Too movement, okay, which is also was based heavily on the social media.
Absolutely. Women's March.
Yeah, and if you also think with this first idea, you will say, okay, there is a concern about how government can use data and to oppress people. Like we can start to see that in China, for example. But if you take the other point of view, you will say, okay, we have to protect people on the internet online. So we have to protect them from cyber criminality. We have to protect them from dark web and trafficking, cyberbullying. We also have exposure of children to extreme violence, of pornography, fake news, impact of mass manipulation online, and the use of social media as a potential propagator of violence. And the Gilets jaunes was also a means to propagate violence on the territory. And at the end, you say, okay, I'm very concerned about the ownership and data, but the way it can be used by not government, but powerful corporations. So the dilemma is quite old, and it's the conflict between the regulation and society and individual liberty. And my point of view is that here we're more a question of scale and than a question of nature. Internet increases these questions, but it's question that we already had with the old media, the existing media. And so the question for me, the real question is not do we need, and I finally answer to what you say, do we need digital declaration, digital right, but what kind of declaration do we need? And what is the philosophical background of this declaration? If it's based on a preeminence of individual blooming, that can be put above the rules of society, it's more the tradition that you will find in the American Declaration of Independence. Because these rights are given by God directly, and so they are above society and government. If you go to a vision where you say, okay, what you put above is the organization of the society and the fact that even if it's government or something that is created by the citizens, so you will be more in the spirit of the French Declaration of Rights and Citizenship, and that you can find many of European Catholic countries. I will say at the end that what is interesting, you made a mention of the Declaration of Rights of 1948, universal, but this text doesn't clarify this ambiguity. It was written at the time when you have the two influences, and I think that is one of the explanations what is not so effective. When you look in terms of effectivity, the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of Human Rights in France are much more effective in terms of legal implications. So I think that we need to clarify this. Otherwise, we'll probably go in new legislation that will not be very effective. And I think that it would be interesting to think about something that you have in the French Declaration of Rights, which is the distinction between the rights for mankind, human rights, and the rights for the citizen. And perhaps that we need to think about what could be on digital citizenship. That will be perhaps a way to find a solution. That's it.
Thank you, thank you. So we have differing views on our panel. So it seems like a pretty clear divide in terms of, so it's fair to say Estelle and Julie, you would say we do actually have the legal framework in place, and there's a lot at risk if we start trying to push for a new declaration of digital rights. Whereas it seems, I don't want to be reductive, but that Jacques and Gael, you're veering more towards the idea that actually we need to be rethinking this, that say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not an adequate. Can we just, an answer, a yes or no answer, I mean, I suspect I know the answer, but if we were to say, today clearly international legal norms and the enforcement of those legal norms are struggling to keep pace with obviously the rapidity of the technological impact on our lives. We would all agree, right? Now I'm going to come back and pick up on that question, but before I do, how we work towards resolving that in MoHo spirit. Before I do, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. And ooh, great, we have lots of, this is wonderful. Let's go.
totally. I mean, I think this is such a complex and nuanced subject, and I applaud you all for immersing yourself in it, because we definitely, no, honestly, we really do need it. My worry is there was a recent series of lectures, they're called the Wreath Lectures on BBC4, and he was a Supreme Court judge. And I think his worry when it comes to, we talk about the rule of law and rights, is that they're really being very heavily impinged upon right now because of failures of democracy, in terms of, there's a lot of these issues that should be resolved democratically through politicians and discussion, and because we can't keep up ethically with what technology can provide us and do for us, we're throwing it at the legal profession, saying you deal with it. And actually we're going to end up in a more sort of authoritarian, constricted regime than we would like. I'm wondering whether rights should be relabeled something like needs rather than rights, because we live in such a diverse, complex world now that it seems like everyone needs a right for something, and I'm just worried that we need a slightly different context in terms of those rights.
Excellent, Tricia. Should we take a couple more and then we'll turn to the panel for their feedback? Yeah.
Okay. So in my day job, my firm advocates, we take as our purpose Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that no person shall be subjected to unfair attacks on their privacy or on their reputation. And we see that that right fits very neatly into the online world, but what we find is incredibly difficult is enforcing that right. So just by way of example, I have a case right now where one of our clients is being attacked by an adversary who's injected fake news that's been picked up. It's now part of Wikipedia. But getting someone to take that content down, even with information that it is factually inaccurate, is incredibly difficult. Wikipedia will say we're not responsible for it, we're just a platform, we're not publishers. So how do you actually enforce these rights in a space that feels ungovernable?
May I, Elizabeth?
Thank you. I'm so glad that Amy brought up the question of enforcement. I think that's critically important, but on top of that, I would also parallel enforcement and responsibility. Who is actually responsible for maintaining this code of human rights? And then when it is violated, who's going to enforce it? And the last step is, who's really going to monitor the enforcers to make certain that it's done unilaterally and not just per one country or per one anything?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. These are excellent questions. And, you know, yeah, when we talk about the risks, I mean, we don't want to be alarmist, but, you know, some would argue that, yeah, the risks are, it's undermining our democracy, this inability to keep pace when it comes to legislation and enforcement. So let's take them one by one. So do we need to reframe it? It's not about rights, it's about needs. This is Tricia's relabeling its needs, and would we progress better with that? Maybe start with that one, and then I'll come to the two other questions. Who would like to answer that one? Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you. Sorry. As a lawyer, a need doesn't mean anything to me. That's my problem. I mean, legally, how do I advocate for a need? I mean, in front of a police officer or a judge, how do I? That would be my problem. But it's probably just a semantic problem. The idea of rights seems interesting to me because these are concepts to which we need to give life afterwards through defining needs or through the definition of, I mean, when you say you have a right to life, it's broad. When does life start, first of all? And it opens up a lot of questions, and it opens up avenue for to define more precisely the notions, the concepts, and the how do you say this? The limits. The boundaries. Yes, thank you. So. Yeah, from a legal perspective, I'm afraid that need doesn't mean anything. And if you give, I mean, we have to think of the internet space as a global space, and a global space where everybody does not have the same understanding of what are needs and what are values. I mean, if you take the right to life in France and in a country like, I don't know, North Korea, I'm sure probably the governments at least probably don't understand it the same way. The judiciary don't understand it the same way. I mean, there is death penalty in some countries and others not. I mean, that's why I think conceptually, historically, human societies need clear definition and strict definitions. And in that sense, the idea of having rights is stronger than having needs, because needs give so much breathing space to governments, and then we know how governments can behave when they have so much unlimited power. That would be my opinion on the issue. But of course, it's challenging. Even us, working in the industry for the past 10 years, we've had to change our opinions on so many things, on regulation itself. 10 years ago, we were all saying, "Oh, please don't leave us alone, leave our space, etc." Now, honestly, I almost regret it, because I'm seeing the consequences, not only in Europe, but also in countries where there's the rule of law is less existing, in Africa or in Latin America. So, yeah.
Thank you. Can we combine the other two questions? So we're talking about enforcement. Clearly, there's an urgent issue there, and of course, responsibility. There will be no enforcement if it's not clearly defined where the responsibilities lies. And that was actually going to be my next question for the panelists anyway. Jacques, would you like to say something on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's very interesting because when I was talking about citizenship, definition of citizenship is that you have a balance between the rights and the responsibilities. That's the difference. Human rights come without no idea of responsibility. You got the right because you are human. If you are a citizen, you are in a specific political space, and you have responsibilities that are attached to your rights. So I think that we have then to make a distinction between the two cases. Individual case, for people, you and me, it's possible, I think, to define a case for citizenship, internet citizenship or digital citizenship, because we are citizens of countries, and then the country can regulate on his space, geographical space. It's much more complicated for corporations, especially for the large international corporations that are big internet players. And so what is very interesting is that we've seen very recently that the leaders of these corporations start to have this idea of, oh yes, I need to define a corporate citizenship. If you see the change of behavior, for example, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, saying that first, no, I'm not involved in this question of regulating the network, and then okay, I see the consequences. You can cheat on the global election of my country. So, but there is not a precise answer on that. I think it's a work in process now, and how we can define this corporate citizenship for digital, and the reality is that government will have a role to play in that, but they cannot find the solution alone. Probably they will have to be helped by citizens and non-profit organizations to do that.
Can we make the mic work? Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay, just before we move on, so I'd like you also to come in on either of those two questions. But just to say, if I've understood correctly, if we're talking about citizenship, I mean, the whole notion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it's universal. And if we then talk about digital citizenship, where does that leave us? You know, then it's sort of a case of which country you live in. I mean, digital citizenship in China would be very different from digital citizenship in France. But before it's fortunate that we have 3 more hours in this panel, so don't worry, we'll get around to that. But let's, please, Estelle, in response to the 2 questions.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing up enforcement. Actually, I think it might be quite interesting to notice that both Julie and I, who work at NGO protecting human rights, are the one asking for no new norms, because it's precisely the point I think we mean. We have those norms, but the enforcement is the issue, and that's through regulation, actually, that you get through that enforcement. If you actually take the example of data protection in Europe, everyone is waking up with GDPR, but let's not forget that in France, we have a data protection law since 1978, and in Europe, we have a global framework since 1995. The only thing is, like, everyone was ignoring it. So it's great that companies are now being super kind, saying like, okay, we'll respect your privacy and your data and your right to data protection. Well, hey, you had to do that by law since 1995, so thank you very much for doing it in 2019. That's very kind of you. But there is double failure here. There is the failure of the state and the authority for enforcing it, but there is also a lack of responsibility from the entities that are now telling us how burdensome it is to catch up and do that. But it's like you had 25 years, pre-internet era, you had those norms that had to apply. So we're catching up, but they're catching up as well because they've been largely ignoring our global norms. And so a lot of those issues, as Jacques mentioned, it's not a new issue, it's a new scale.
Yeah. Can we be really explicit? So, I wanted to ask you, okay, are we doing enough and who is we? So it really is the question of where do the responsibilities lie? So who's they?
Sorry, so there is different layers of responsibility, but when I say they, here is the companies which have chosen to have a business model harvesting our data, ignoring that we had data protection frameworks already in place, and now are kind of saying like, but it clashes with our business models. Like, well, your business model was clashing with our human rights. So that should not have happened probably in the first place, and now there is a need to readapt, and there was a problem with a lack of enforcement that led that to happen, but innovation is obviously something very positive, but innovation needs to happen within the framework that respects the rights we've decided to live in a democratic society.
So, yes, please go ahead, Julie. No, go ahead.
Companies are not, they're also bound by human rights. We tend to forget it. There are principles on business and human rights, which remind companies that they also have a responsibility. And I think that responsibility is even more important in societies at a time where democracy is so in danger because of governments. So everybody has a role to play. Civil society does it, private sector needs to do it too.
Should we we've timed for a few more questions, and I'd like to come back to this idea of, the enforcement, but let's take a few more questions. Wow, great. Go ahead. The gentleman who said we didn't need a declaration of digital rights.
No, I didn't say that.
No, you didn't say it. You didn't raise your hand.
I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure we do. I'm not sure whether actually things like the ECHR don't protect us well enough in the realms of the private and the state. But that's not where I want to go. I'd like to come back to something like that Gael said, if I may, which is the responsibility of business being to innovate and the responsibility of the public sector to regulate. Great at a high level. Trouble is, business needs good regulation in order to be able to innovate. It needs a secure, stable framework in which to innovate. So my question is, what is the responsibility of business in making sure that the regulator understands the innovation well enough to make sure that the regulation is sensible and works for everyone, including the innovator?
Great question. Can we take one more, please?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Jacques' excellent sort of summary of our core dilemma between, maybe you could call it freedom to and freedom from, freedom to do whatever we want and freedom from harm. And just drill in on one example. I work for a large news agency. We've added on about 40 journalists who do nothing but fact-checking in the last couple of years. And so as a journalist and as an American, I guess, I'm a bit of an absolutist on free speech. That's my first instinct, anyhow. But as someone who covers climate change, when I see a story that's just flat wrong, that's deliberately wrong, I want to see that disappear. How do you thread that needle? Where do you draw the line between fake news? And Andre referred to very soon we're going to have deep fake news, which is a really scary thing if you understand what that is. Do we need to reframe that dilemma somehow, or otherwise it's a legal question, it's an ethical question? Where do you draw the line?
Okay, who would like to come in response to the first question? I guess it's Gael. Would you like to answer the first question about the role of business in making government, for the regulators, aware of what is at stake in terms of their technological innovation? That's the question. I love that. In an ideal world, that would happen. They would be knocking at the door in advance, saying in 2 years' time. No, go ahead. it is in their interest, but all corporate social responsibility. Let's see what Gael has to say.
It's a tricky question, actually. Those guys, they are not here to please the regulators and governments. So I don't think it. Well, they can explain, but yeah, there are 1,000 experts who can explain technology, innovation, etc. Those guys are just most of the time taking the technology and making a business of it. They don't invent most of the time. Okay, they have labs, etc. But so I think they really have to have more stronger boundaries for their businesses, and this is really a question of scale. I think the question of scale is essential because what we see now, and it's probably the first time in history that this is happening, is that we have large corporations like Facebook and Google, which are so global that they can define their own rules for all the worlds of the people, probably. Maybe outside China, which is very close, and North Korea, and that's the difficulty, and that's the reason why I think we really need a common reference, a text to where we all agree for ethics in the digital world, and so.
Thank you. Yes, Jacques, would you like? Yes, sure.
Yeah, I was just thinking that one of the tools, important means that we can use for the future is education. Basically, it comes back to school lab, because our conviction is that to master the technology and innovation, you have to have people who are trained, who have education, and I think that possibly that one of the explanation of the problems that we have is that in this tech company, you have many people who have an excellent academic background, very technical academic background, and not all of them, but most of them are not familiar to this question that we are discussing now about, okay, what is law, what do you have a government, what is it to live in a society, and you need to educate people in the tech companies, and you need also to educate citizens about how to use the technology, and also the government about the issues of tech. But I think that the two first ones are more important.
Thank you. Can we maybe then address this second question? Because it's the second time we've heard the reframing. Possibly we should be reframing this dilemma. And you talked about, fake news and the deep fake news. And yeah, I mean, we've seen the dangers of that. We're seeing it all the time. Who would like to respond to that? Okay, Jacques, would you like to respond to that? Because actually it was in response to the way you actually framed the issue. So the gentleman, would you like to say?
The point is, to be frank, that I just know what everybody knows now, that there is technological now, you can technologically make some information that look absolutely true by all means that are completely false, including faking the faces, attitude, making completely video that looks original that are completely false. And I don't know, my point of view, personal point of view, is that we should be regulated very hard on that, and that it should be forbidden, absolutely. The question is how to detect that. The first thing that I think interesting is that there are now some research about academic research about fake news, and the scientists start to find some patterns, especially in the way the fake news are broadcast on the network, and it's easier than before to identify these artifacts, these fake news. So there is hope, but I think that yes, there must be a mobilization of citizens about this and asking the government to regulate about this.
Thanks. That's talking about regulating. That's really an important point, and linked to the reframing debate. There is currently a movement on the issue of content moderation by platforms. Companies like Facebook or Google are thinking of creating sort of what they call court of appeals, internal court of appeals. I mean, that would be the equivalent. So basically, it's a board which would be responsible to, for instance, if your content has been taken down by Facebook and you don't know why, the board would be responsible to reevaluate, basically to say whether Facebook has indeed applied in the right way. I think that's, although it's self-regulation to some extent, I think governments have also a role to play in there, and in order, help companies frame it not based on their community standards, saying we moderate based on our community standards, but have them moderate based on legislation and human rights. I think that's...
Thank you.
And it also would help regulate fake and...
Excellent. So we are unfortunately running out of time. We are in a complex, imperfect world and in a complex, imperfect situation. I just want to turn to our panelists and say, in 1 or 2 words, what action would you like to see more action to drive progress with regard to this question, this issue? 1 or 2 words.
Jacques. Education. No.
Multi-stakeholder collaboration.
Reminding of our human rights and enforcing them.
What comes to mind is better privacy for users' data.
Thank you so much.
Thank our panelists. Thank you very much for being a great interactive audience. And thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you.